The evening shift at Cielo's had been long and unforgiving. Elena Rivera wiped down the last table near the window, her fingers aching from hours of carrying heavy trays and forcing smiles at customers who barely looked up from their plates. The small Italian restaurant tucked into a narrow Brooklyn street corner was nothing fancy. Checkered tablecloths, dim lighting, and the constant smell of garlic and tomato sauce that clung to her uniform no matter how many times she washed it. But it paid enough to cover rent, her mother's medication, and the occasional grocery run that didn't leave her account in the negatives. That was all that mattered. She had been working at Cielo's for just over 3 months now, ever since she'd walked in one desperate afternoon and begged the manager, Tony, for any opening. He'd taken one look at her worn-out sneakers and the determination in her eyes and hired her on the spot. No questions asked. She was grateful. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and in a city that chewed people up and spat them out without a second thought, that was something. Elena glanced at the clock above the bar. 10:45. 15 more minutes, and she could finally go home, peel off her shoes, and collapse into bed. Her feet throbbed with every step as she carried the last tray of dirty dishes back to the kitchen. The cook, an older man named Sal, who rarely spoke but always left her a plate of pasta at the end of her shift, nodded at her as she passed. She gave him a tired smile in return. The restaurant was nearly empty now. Just 2 tables left, a couple finishing their tiramisu in the corner, and an older gentleman nursing his 3rd glass of red wine at the bar. The night was winding down, and Elena felt herself relax just a little. Maybe tonight would end peacefully. Maybe she could walk home without looking over her shoulder. Maybe. The front door slammed open. Elena's heart stopped. She knew that walk before she even turned around. Heavy, uneven footsteps. The sharp smell of whiskey and rage. Her stomach twisted into a knot as she forced herself to look toward the entrance. Ryan Blake stood in the doorway, his face flushed red, his shirt half untucked, and his eyes wild with a fury she had seen too many times before. He scanned the room like a predator searching for prey, and when his gaze landed on her, his mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a grin. "There you are," he slurred, his voice loud enough to make the couple in the corner glance up nervously. "You think you can just ignore me? Block my number? Act like I don't exist?" Elena's hands trembled as she set down the tray on the nearest table. Her mind raced. She had broken up with Ryan 4 months ago after a year of emotional manipulation, jealous outbursts, and nights spent wondering if he would finally cross the line from words to fists. She had blocked his number, changed her routines, and even moved apartments to get away from him. But somehow, he always found her. "Ryan, please," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave. I'm working." "Working?" He laughed bitterly and took a stumbling step forward. "You think I care? You owe me a conversation, Elena. You don't just walk away from me like I'm nothing." Tony emerged from the back, his apron still on, his expression tense. "Hey, buddy, you need to leave. Now." Ryan's eyes flicked toward Tony, then back to Elena. "Stay out of this, old man. This is between me and her." "There is no me and you anymore," Elena said, her voice shaking but firm. "We're done. I told you that. Please, just go." "Done?" Ryan's voice rose, echoing through the small space. "You don't get to decide that. You think you can just throw me away like trash? After everything I did for you?" The other customers were staring now, frozen in their seats. Elena felt the weight of their eyes on her, the shame and fear mixing into something hot and suffocating in her chest. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run. But her legs wouldn't move. Ryan took another step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're coming outside. We're gonna talk. Right now." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you are." Before she could react, Ryan lunged forward and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin with a force that made her gasp. He yanked her toward the door, ignoring her protests, ignoring Tony's shouts, ignoring the couple at the corner table who scrambled out of their chairs in shock. "Let go of me!" Elena struggled, trying to pull away, but Ryan's grip only tightened. He dragged her across the floor, her feet scraping against the tiles as she tried to resist. "You're gonna listen to me whether you like it or not," Ryan hissed, his breath hot and sour against her face. The door swung open, and the cold night air hit her like a slap. Elena's heart pounded in her ears as Ryan pulled her onto the sidewalk, his hand still locked around her arm. She could hear Tony yelling behind them, could see the horrified faces of passers-by. But everything felt distant, muffled, like she was underwater. And then, from the shadows of the alley beside the restaurant, a voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go." It was calm, cold, and unmistakably commanding. Ryan froze. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, they both turned toward the source of the voice. A man stepped out from the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the streetlight. His face was half-shadowed, but his eyes, sharp, dark, and utterly devoid of warmth, fixed on Ryan with the kind of intensity that made grown men confess to sins they hadn't committed. "I said," the man repeated, his voice dropping even lower, "let her go." Ryan's grip on Elena's arm loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, though his voice lacked the confidence it had inside. The man didn't answer. He simply took one step forward, and the air around them seemed to shift. Elena felt it. A presence, a weight, something dangerous and unspoken. And from the way Ryan's face paled, she knew he felt it too. Two more figures emerged from the alley behind the man. Large, silent, and dressed in black. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Ryan's hand dropped from Elena's arm as if she'd burned him. He stumbled backward, his bravado crumbling. "Look, man, this is none of your business." "Everything that happens in front of my property is my business," the man said, his tone as sharp as a blade. "And you just made it mine." Elena stared at him, her mind racing. His property? She'd never seen this man before. Who was he? The man's gaze flicked to her, and for a brief moment, something softened in his expression. "What's your name?" "Elena," she stammered. He nodded once, then turned his attention back to Ryan. "Elena works for me now, and if I ever see you near her again, if I even hear your name in connection with hers, you'll wish tonight had ended differently." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but one of the men in black stepped forward, and whatever protest he had died in his throat. Without another word, Ryan turned and stumbled away down the street, disappearing into the night. Elena stood frozen, her heart still racing, her arm throbbing where Ryan had grabbed her. She looked up at the man in the suit, this stranger who had just changed everything with a few quiet words. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man's expression was unreadable. He glanced at the restaurant, then back at her. "Someone who doesn't like bullies," he said simply. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back into the shadows, his men following silently behind him. And just like that, he was gone. Elena stood alone on the sidewalk, trembling, the cool night air biting at her skin. Inside the restaurant, Tony was calling her name, but she couldn't move. All she could do was stare at the empty alley where the man had disappeared, wondering who he was, and why he had just saved her life. The next morning, Elena woke up with bruises on her arm and 1,000 questions in her mind. She had barely slept, replaying the events of the previous night over and over until they blurred together into a surreal, nightmarish loop. Ryan's grip, the stranger's voice, the way those two men had appeared from nowhere like ghosts. And that look, the one the stranger had given Ryan, cold and absolute, like a judge delivering a death sentence without raising his voice. She sat at the edge of her bed in her tiny studio apartment, staring at the purple marks blooming across her forearm. They were shaped like fingerprints, evidence. She should have gone to the police, filed a report, done something official and responsible. But what would she even say? That her ex-boyfriend had dragged her outside, and a mysterious man in a suit had made him leave. That she didn't even know the man's name, but somehow felt safer because of him than she had in months? No, the police wouldn't care. They never did. Instead, Elena got dressed, pulled on a long-sleeved shirt to cover the bruises, and headed to work. She needed the routine, needed the distraction, needed to feel like her life wasn't completely spinning out of control. When she arrived at Cielo's, the atmosphere was different. The usual morning prep was happening, Sal chopping vegetables in the back, the waitstaff setting tables. But there was a strange tension in the air. People were whispering, glancing at her. Tony pulled her aside the moment she walked through the door. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his weathered face lined with genuine concern. "I'm fine," Elena lied. "Just tired." Tony didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Listen, about last night, that guy, the one who showed up." Elena's pulse quickened. "What about him?" Tony lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Do you know who that was?" She shook her head. "No. I've never seen him before." Tony exhaled slowly, running a hand through his thinning hair. That was Adrian Moretti. The name meant nothing to her. "Who?" Tony stared at her like she'd just admitted she didn't know who the president was. "Adrian Moretti. Elena, he owns this place." Elena blinked. "What?" "You own this place. You hired me." "I manage it," Tony corrected. "But Moretti owns it. He owns half the block. Hell, he owns half of Brooklyn, depending on who you ask. He's not exactly a businessman in the traditional sense." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" Tony glanced over his shoulder again, then leaned in closer. "I'm saying he's connected. You understand? The kind of connected where people don't ask questions. The kind where problems disappear." Her stomach dropped. He's in the Mafia?" Tony winced at the word but didn't deny it. "Look, all I know is this. Moretti doesn't come around often. Maybe once or twice a year, and when he does, it's always unannounced. He likes to check on his investments quietly. Last night, he must have been in the alley for God knows what reason, and he saw what happened. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Now you're on his radar." Elena didn't know whether to feel terrified or relieved. "What does that mean?" "It means be careful," Tony said seriously. "Moretti doesn't do anything without a reason. If he stepped in for you, it's because he decided you were worth protecting. But that comes with complications." Before Elena could respond, one of the other waitresses, Maria, poked her head into the hallway. "Tony, there's someone here to see Elena." Elena's heart skipped. "Who?" Maria's eyes were wide. "He didn't say, but he's upstairs." Upstairs, the second floor of the building next to the restaurant. Elena had never been up there. It was always locked, always off limits. She'd assumed it was storage, or maybe private offices for the owner, whoever that was, or rather, whoever she now knew it to be. Tony gave her a long look. "Go. Don't keep him waiting." Elena's hands were shaking as she climbed the narrow staircase at the back of the building. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with possibilities. What did Adrian Moretti want with her? Was she in trouble? Was this some kind of test? Or worse, was this the moment where she learned exactly what kind of man he really was? The door at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar. She hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in." His voice was just as she remembered, low, calm, and carrying an authority that made disobedience seem impossible. Elena pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was nothing like she expected. It wasn't some dark, smoky den filled with weapons and shadowy figures. It was an office. A beautiful one. Sleek wooden desk, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a large window overlooking the street below. And sitting behind the desk, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, was Adrian Moretti. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes, dark, intense, unreadable, studied her with the same quiet focus he'd had the night before. But this time, there was something else there too. Curiosity, maybe, or calculation. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Elena obeyed, her pulse hammering in her ears. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "How's your arm?" The question caught her off guard. "It's fine." Liar. His tone wasn't harsh, just matter of fact. "You're wearing long sleeves in the middle of summer. He hurt you." Elena swallowed hard. "It's just bruises. I've had worse." Something flickered across Adrian's face. Anger, maybe, or disgust. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "That's not acceptable." "I didn't ask for your help," Elena said quietly, then immediately regretted it. Who was she to talk back to someone like him? But Adrian didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked almost amused. "No, you didn't. But I gave it anyway. And now we need to discuss what happens next." "What do you mean?" Adrian steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Your ex-boyfriend is a problem. Men like him don't stop unless they're made to stop. Last night was a warning, but warnings don't always work." Elena's chest tightened. "What are you going to do to him?" "Nothing, unless he gives me a reason to." Adrian's tone was casual, almost indifferent. "But I don't trust him to stay away, which means you need protection." "I can't afford—" "I'm not asking you to pay for it," Adrian interrupted. "I'm offering you a job." Elena stared at him. "A job? I already work here." "Not as a waitress," Adrian said. "I need someone I can trust to manage the restaurant's finances, oversee the staff, handle the books. Someone honest. Someone who won't ask too many questions, but will tell me the truth when it matters." Elena's mind reeled. "Why me? You don't even know me." Adrian's gaze was steady. "I know enough. I know you work 3 shifts a week and send half your paycheck to your mother's nursing care. I know you've been late on rent twice, but never missed a day of work. I know you broke up with that piece of trash 4 months ago and have been looking over your shoulder ever since. And I know that last night when he grabbed you, you didn't scream. You fought." Elena's breath caught. He'd done his homework. He knew everything. "So," Adrian continued, his voice soft but firm, "do you want the job or not?" Elena looked at him. This dangerous, enigmatic man who had appeared out of nowhere and was now offering her something that felt too good to be true. But what choice did she have? Go back to waiting tables and hoping Ryan never showed up again? Live in fear for the rest of her life? "Yes," she whispered. "I'll take it." Adrian nodded once. "Good. You start tomorrow." And just like that, Elena Rivera's life changed forever. The first week of Elena's new position was a whirlwind of ledgers, supplier invoices, payroll sheets, and staff schedules. She'd expected the transition to be awkward, maybe even hostile. After all, she'd gone from pouring water and taking orders to managing the people she used to work alongside. But Adrian Moretti had a way of making sure his decisions were unquestioned. When Tony introduced her as the new administrative manager, no one dared to object. Not openly, anyway. Still, Elena could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers in the kitchen. the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. She wasn't naive. She knew what they thought, that she was Adrian's girl, his mistress, his pet project, that she'd slept her way into the position or somehow manipulated him into giving her special treatment. It stung, but she kept her head down and focused on the work. She had something to prove, and she was determined to prove it. The office Adrian had given her was small but functional, tucked into a corner of the second floor, with a window that overlooked the alley where everything had started. She spent her days reviewing expense reports, negotiating with vendors, and learning the intricate web of relationships that kept Cielo's running. And slowly, she began to see the bigger picture. The restaurant wasn't just a restaurant. It was a hub, a meeting place, a front. She didn't need anyone to spell it out for her. She wasn't stupid. The men who came and went at odd hours, always nodding respectfully at Tony, but never ordering food. The cash payments that didn't match the register receipts. The way Adrian's name could make a problem disappear with a single phone call. Cielo's was clean on paper, but the world it existed in was anything but. And yet, Adrian himself remained a mystery. He came by the restaurant 3 or 4 times a week, always unannounced, always dressed like he'd just stepped out of a board meeting. He'd check in with Tony, glance over the books Elena prepared, and then disappear without a word. He was polite, professional, and completely impenetrable. He never asked her about her personal life, never made small talk, never crossed the invisible line he'd drawn between them, until the day he found her crying in the office. It was late, nearly midnight. Elena had stayed behind to finish reconciling a particularly messy week of accounts, determined to get everything perfect before Adrian's next visit. She'd been so focused on the numbers that she didn't notice the time slipping away, didn't hear the door downstairs open and close, didn't realize she wasn't alone until she heard footsteps on the stairs. She looked up, startled, and quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But it was too late. Adrian stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something sharper. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Nothing," Elena lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Adrian didn't move. He stood there studying her with that unnerving intensity, and Elena felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "My mom," she said finally, her voice breaking. "She's getting worse. The doctors say she needs a different medication, but the insurance won't cover it, and I don't know how I'm going to pay for it." She hated how weak she sounded, hated that she was crying in front of him, hated that she'd let her guard down. But Adrian didn't look disgusted or annoyed. He simply walked into the room, pulled a chair over, and sat down across from her. "How much?" he asked. Elena blinked. "What?" "How much does the medication cost?" She hesitated. $1,200 a month. Adrian pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, and then set it back in his pocket. "Done." Elena stared at him. "What do you mean, done?" "I mean the money will be in your account by morning. Consider it part of your salary." "I can't accept that," Elena said immediately. "That's too much. I didn't take this job to—" "I know why you took this job," Adrian interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "And I know you're not the type to ask for handouts, but you work for me now, and I take care of the people who work for me. That's non-negotiable." Elena opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was simply certainty. A decision made and closed. Final. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian nodded once and stood to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused and glanced back at her. "You're doing good work here, Elena. Don't think I haven't noticed." And then he was gone. leaving her alone in the quiet office with 1,000 emotions swirling in her chest. Over the next few weeks, something shifted between them. It was subtle, small moments that most people wouldn't have noticed. Adrian started checking in with her more often, asking her opinion on things beyond just the books. He'd bring her coffee when she worked late. Once, when she mentioned she was having trouble with a particularly aggressive supplier, the man called her the next day, apologetic and willing to negotiate. She didn't ask what Adrian had said or done. She didn't need to. And she started to see beyond the cold, controlled exterior he presented to the world. She saw the way he treated his men with respect, the way he listened when people spoke, the way he never raised his voice, but always made himself heard. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes some nights, the weight of responsibilities she couldn't begin to imagine. She saw a man who had built an empire out of necessity and was now trying to figure out what to do with it. One evening, as they sat in the office going over the quarterly reports, Adrian leaned back in his chair and studied her with that familiar, unreadable expression. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Elena looked up, surprised. He rarely asked personal questions. "Of course." "Why did you stay with him, your ex?" The question caught her off guard. She set down her pen, her mind racing. "I don't know," she admitted. "At first he was different, charming, attentive. And then it changed, little by little, until I didn't recognize him anymore. Or maybe I didn't recognize myself. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I was better, he'd go back to who he was. But people don't go back, do they?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said softly. "They don't." Something in his tone made Elena think he wasn't just talking about Ryan anymore. But before she could ask, he stood and changed the subject, and the moment passed. Still, from that night on, Elena felt like she understood him a little better. And maybe, just maybe, he understood her too. But understanding wasn't safety, and the past, as Elena was about to learn, had a way of refusing to stay buried. It started with a phone call Elena wasn't supposed to hear. She'd been in the kitchen, helping Sal prep for the evening rush, when she saw one of Adrian's men, a quiet, intimidating guy named Marco, standing near the back exit, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, his voice low and urgent. Elena wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but she caught a few words, enough to make her blood run cold. "Blake, talking to the Volkovs, thinks he can make a deal." Elena froze. Blake, as in Ryan Blake, her ex-boyfriend, the man Adrian had warned to stay away. And the Volkovs, she'd heard that name before, whispered in hushed tones by Tony and the other staff. A rival family, dangerous, ruthless. Marco ended the call and disappeared through the back door before Elena could react. Her mind raced. What was Ryan doing talking to the Volkovs? And why would they even give him the time of day? She tried to push the thought away, to focus on her work, but it gnawed at her for the rest of the shift. When the restaurant finally closed and the staff filtered out, Elena stayed behind, pacing her small office. She should tell Adrian. But what if she was wrong? What if Marco had been talking about someone else? She didn't want to look paranoid or cause unnecessary trouble. But then again, if Ryan was planning something, if he'd somehow aligned himself with people who wanted to hurt Adrian, then staying silent could be worse. Elena pulled out her phone and stared at Adrian's contact. He'd given her his personal number weeks ago, telling her to call if there was ever an emergency. This felt like an emergency. Her thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed it. He answered on the second ring. "Elena? Her voice faltered. "I think there's something you need to know." 30 minutes later, Adrian walked into the restaurant alone. No entourage, no Marco or the other men who usually shadowed him. just him, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket that made him look less like a businessman and more like the dangerous man Elena suspected he truly was. "Tell me," he said simply, his eyes locked on hers. Elena explained what she'd overheard, every word, every detail. Adrian listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "The Volkovs," he said finally, almost to himself. "Of course." "What does that mean?" Elena asked. "Why would Ryan go to them?" Adrian's gaze sharpened. "Because he's an idiot with a grudge, and no idea what he's walking into. The Volkovs have been looking for a way to undermine me for months. If your ex convinced them he could give them leverage, information, access, anything, they'd use him and throw him away the second he stopped being useful." Elena's stomach twisted. "What kind of leverage?" Adrian hesitated, then met her eyes. "You." The word hung in the air like a knife. Elena felt her breath catch. "Me? You work for me now. You have access to this place, to the books, to people. If Ryan convinced the Volkovs that you could be turned or taken, they'd see you as a weakness, a way to get to me." Elena's hands were shaking. "I would never." "I know," Adrian said firmly, "but they don't, and Ryan's betting on that." Elena felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "So what do we do?" Adrian studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "We? This isn't your fight, Elena." "Yes, it is," she shot back. "He dragged me into this the second he showed up here, the second he put his hands on me. I'm not running, not anymore." For the first time since she'd met him, Adrian smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. "All right," he said. "Then we make sure he regrets ever thinking he could use you against me." Over the next week, Elena became Adrian's silent partner in something she never imagined she'd be part of. He explained, carefully and without unnecessary details, that the Volkovs were planning something. A move against one of his shipments, maybe, or an attack on one of his properties. They didn't know exactly what yet, but they knew Ryan was involved. And if Ryan was involved, he'd need to communicate, to coordinate. That's where Elena came in. Adrian had one of his tech guys, a wiry kid named Danny who looked like he'd never seen sunlight, set up a program on Elena's phone. It monitored Ryan's social media, his emails, even his text messages. It was illegal as hell, but Elena didn't care. Ryan had forfeited his right to privacy the moment he'd grabbed her arm and dragged her into the street. For days, nothing. And then, late one night, Elena's phone buzzed. A new email. From Ryan, to an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, but the message wasn't. "She's in. I can get her to slip up. Just give me time." Elena's blood ran cold. She screenshotted the email and immediately sent it to Adrian. His response came less than a minute later. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." 20 minutes later, Adrian was in her apartment, her small, cramped studio that she'd never expected him to see. He didn't comment on the chipped paint or the second-hand furniture. He just sat down at her kitchen table, pulled out his phone, and made a series of calls in a language Elena didn't understand. Russian, maybe, or Ukrainian. When he hung up, he looked at her. He's lying to them, telling them he can manipulate you. But he doesn't have anything real, which means he's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. "So what do we do?" Elena asked. Adrian's smile was cold. "We give him what he wants. We let him think he's winning, and then we take everything away." The plan was simple, brilliant, and terrifying. Elena would agree to meet Ryan. She'd tell him she wanted to talk, that she was scared and confused and needed closure. She'd wear a wire, something small and undetectable that Danny set up, and she'd let Ryan incriminate himself. Admit that he was working with the Volkovs. Admit that he planned to use her. And once they had the confession, Adrian would handle the rest. Elena agreed without hesitation. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was furious. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a coffee shop in Midtown, public enough to seem safe. Elena sat at a corner table, her heart pounding, the tiny microphone taped under her collar. Ryan walked in 10 minutes late, his usual cocky smirk plastered on his face. "Hey, babe," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I knew you'd come around." Elena forced a smile. "I just want to understand what happened." "Why you've been doing this?" Ryan leaned back, confident. "You really want to know? Fine. You embarrassed me, Elena. You made me look weak, and then that psycho in the suit threatened me like I was nobody. So I found people who could do something about it. People who actually have power." "The Volkovs," Elena said quietly. Ryan's eyes lit up. "You know about them." "I know enough." "Then you know they're going to take Moretti down, and when they do, I'm going to be there to watch. Maybe I'll even get a front row seat to whatever they do to you for working with him." Elena's stomach turned, but she kept her voice steady. "And what do they want from me?" Ryan grinned. "Information, access, proof that Moretti's dirty. You're the key, babe. You just don't know it yet." That was all Adrian needed. 2 days later, Ryan Blake disappeared. Not violently, not publicly. He simply stopped existing. His social media went dark. His apartment was cleared out. And when Elena asked Adrian what happened, he simply said, "He won't bother you again." She didn't ask for details. She didn't want them. But the Volkovs were a different story. The fallout from Ryan's disappearance was swift and brutal, though not in the way Elena expected. She had imagined sirens, police questioning, maybe even reporters swarming the restaurant. But there was nothing. No investigation, no missing persons report. It was as if Ryan Blake had never existed at all. And in Adrian Moretti's world, Elena was beginning to understand that's exactly how these things worked. But the Volkovs didn't let it go so easily. 2 weeks after Ryan vanished, the tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of Brooklyn's underworld began to boil over. It started small, shipments delayed, suppliers suddenly backing out of contracts, a fire at one of Adrian's warehouses that the fire marshal ruled accidental, but everyone knew wasn't. The Volkovs were sending a message. They knew Adrian had dealt with Ryan, and they weren't going to let it slide. Elena watched it all unfold from her small office at Cielo's, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She'd helped expose Ryan. She'd been part of the plan that led to his downfall. And now, whether she liked it or not, she was part of the war that followed. Adrian kept her informed, but only to a point. He never gave her graphic details, never involved her in the actual operations, but he didn't hide the reality either. One night, after a particularly tense meeting with his inner circle, he stopped by her office and sat down across from her. His usual composure cracked just enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath. "You should go stay with your mother for a while," he said quietly, "until this is over." Elena shook her head. "No." "Elena." "I'm not running," she interrupted. "I told you that before. If the Volkovs want to come after me, then they'll have to do it while I'm standing right here. Besides, my mother needs round-the-clock care now. I can't just uproot her because things are getting dangerous." Adrian studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "You understand what you're risking. I understand that you've protected me when you didn't have to. I understand that you've given me a life I didn't think was possible, and I understand that running now would make me a coward." She held his gaze. "I'm not a coward." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Respect, maybe, or admiration. "No," he said softly. "You're not." From that moment on, Elena was no longer just an employee. She was part of the inner circle, whether officially or not. Adrian started bringing her into strategy meetings, asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with finances or restaurant management. She learned about territories and alliances, about debts owed and vendettas carried across generations. She learned that Adrian wasn't just trying to maintain his empire, he was trying to legitimize it, to transition away from the violence and chaos that had built his family's name and turn it into something clean, legal, sustainable. "My father built this world on fear," Adrian told her one night, his voice heavy with something Elena couldn't quite name. "And it worked. For a time. But fear only lasts as long as you're willing to keep hurting people. I'm tired of hurting people, Elena. I want to build something that doesn't require blood to survive." "Then why not just walk away?" Elena asked. "Sell everything. Start over somewhere else." Adrian's laugh was bitter. "You don't just walk away from this, not without consequences. The moment I show weakness, every rival family in the city will come for what's mine. The only way out is forward. Make the empire legitimate enough that no one can touch it without legal repercussions." "And Cielo's?" "Cielo's is the prototype. A real business. Clean books. Honest employees. If I can make it work here, I can make it work everywhere else." Elena understood then why he'd hired her. Why he'd chosen someone with no connections to his world. No loyalty except the one he'd earned. She was proof that his plan could work. That people could be trusted. That there was another way. But the Volkovs didn't care about Adrian's dreams of legitimacy. They cared about power. And they were getting bolder. The attack came on a Thursday night, just after closing. Elena was upstairs in her office finishing up payroll when she heard the crash. Glass shattering. Shouting. She ran to the window and looked down at the street below, her heart lurching into her throat. 4 men. Dressed in black. Baseball bats and crowbars. They were smashing the windows of Cielo's, tearing through the outdoor seating, spray painting the walls with Cyrillic letters Elena couldn't read, but knew meant nothing good. She grabbed her phone and called Adrian. He answered immediately. "They're here," she said, her voice shaking. "At the restaurant. They're destroying it." "Get out," Adrian said, his voice sharp. "Now. Use the back exit. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." But Elena couldn't run. Not when Sal was still in the kitchen. Not when Maria, who'd stayed late to help clean, was somewhere inside. Not when this place, this small, worn-down restaurant that had given her a second chance, was being torn apart. She hung up and ran downstairs. The front entrance was chaos. Broken glass, overturned tables, the smell of gasoline. One of the men saw her and grinned, raising his bat. "You Moretti's girl?" he asked in heavily accented English. Elena didn't answer. She grabbed a heavy frying pan from the kitchen counter and swung it at his head with everything she had. He went down hard, blood streaming from his temple. The other 3 turned, surprised, and for a split second, Elena realized what she'd just done. And then Marco and 3 other men burst through the back entrance, guns drawn. The Volkov thugs didn't stand a chance. Within seconds, they were on the ground, disarmed, begging for mercy in a language Elena didn't understand. Marco looked at her, his expression somewhere between impressed and horrified. "Boss is gonna kill you for not leaving." Elena was still holding the frying pan, her hands trembling. "He can get in line." Adrian arrived 15 minutes later, his face a mask of controlled fury. He took one look at the wreckage, then at Elena, then at the unconscious man at her feet. His jaw tightened. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." "Did you hit him?" "Yes." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, then did something Elena never expected. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed through the destroyed restaurant. "You're insane," he said, shaking his head. Absolutely insane. I wasn't going to just let them destroy this place, Elena said defensively. I know. Adrian's expression softened. That's what makes you dangerous. The Volkovs retaliated the next day, a drive-by shooting at one of Adrian's clubs. No one was killed, but the message was clear. This was war, and it was escalating. But Elena had already made her choice. She wasn't a bystander anymore. She was all in. The war with the Volkovs didn't end with grand gestures or cinematic showdowns. It ended the way most wars do. Slowly, through attrition, negotiation, and the quiet dismantling of power structures. Adrian was patient, methodical, and ruthless when necessary. He cut off the Volkovs' supply lines, turned their allies, and made it clear that continuing the fight would cost them more than they could afford to lose. And when Dmitry Volkov, the aging patriarch of the family, finally agreed to a sit-down, it was on Adrian's terms. Elena wasn't at the meeting. Adrian had insisted she stay far away from the formal negotiations, not because he didn't trust her, but because he wanted to keep her name out of the official record. The less they know about you, the safer you are, he'd said. And she'd reluctantly agreed. But when Adrian returned from the meeting, his expression was lighter than she'd seen in weeks. He found her in her office, staring at the new windows that had just been installed after the attack. It's over, he said simply. Elena turned, her heart skipping. Over? Volkov agreed to a truce. We drew new territorial lines. They stay out of my businesses. I stay out of theirs. No more retaliation. No more bloodshed. Elena exhaled, a weight she didn't realize she'd been carrying lifting from her chest. And Ryan? Officially, he's a closed chapter. Volkov claimed he was a rogue operator they never fully trusted. Convenient for them, convenient for us. Elena nodded slowly. So what happens now? Adrian walked over to the window, looking down at the street below. The same street where he'd first intervened, where everything had started. Now, he said, we rebuild. Properly this time. Cielo's reopens. Bigger. Better. Legitimate in every sense of the word. And I'm making you a partner. Elena's eyes widened. What? You heard me. You've earned it. You've proven you're not just capable. You're essential. Cielo's wouldn't have survived without you. I wouldn't have survived without you. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. Adrian, Don't argue, he said with a small smile. I've already had the papers drawn up. You're a co-owner now. 50-50. This place is as much yours as it is mine. For a moment, Elena couldn't speak. She thought about the girl who'd walked into this restaurant 4 months ago, desperate and afraid, willing to do anything just to survive. And now she was standing here, being offered a future she'd never dared to dream of. Thank you, she whispered. Adrian turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I should be thanking you. You could have run a dozen times. You could have stayed silent when you overheard Marco. You could have let those men destroy this place. But you didn't. You fought. And that's the kind of partner I need. Over the next 6 months, Cielo's transformed. The old checkered tablecloths were replaced with crisp white linens. The dim lighting gave way to elegant fixtures. The menu expanded, featuring high-end Italian cuisine crafted by a new head chef Adrian poached from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Manhattan. But despite the upgrades, the heart of the place remained the same. It was still a neighborhood spot. Still a place where people felt welcome. Still a place where Elena knew every regular by name. Adrian kept his promise. Every aspect of the business was legitimate now. The books were clean. The staff were paid fairly with full benefits. And when health inspectors or tax auditors came by, there was nothing to hide. Cielo's became the model for Adrian's broader plan, proof that he could build something that didn't rely on fear or violence to succeed. But more than that, the restaurant became a symbol. For Elena, it was proof that survival could turn into something beautiful, that the worst moments of her life could be the foundation for the best ones. And for Adrian, it was proof that change was possible, that a man could be defined by more than his past. Their relationship evolved too, though neither of them rushed to put a label on it. They worked side by side every day, their partnership built on trust and mutual respect. There were long nights spent going over expansion plans, quiet dinners after closing where they talked about everything except business, and small moments, a hand on her shoulder, a lingering glance, that suggested something deeper was growing between them. One evening, nearly a year after the attack, Elena stood at the entrance of Cielo's, watching the dining room buzz with life. Every table was full. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Sal was in the kitchen, training a new line cook. Maria was managing the front of house with confidence. And in the corner booth, Adrian sat with a group of investors, discussing plans to open a second location. He looked up and caught her eye, and for a moment, the rest of the room faded away. He excused himself from the table and walked over to her. "Proud of what we've built?" he asked. Elena smiled. "Yeah, I am." Adrian's expression softened. "I never thanked you properly, for that night in the alley, for staying, for everything." "You've thanked me plenty," Elena said. "You gave me a life, Adrian, a real one." "No," Adrian said quietly. "You gave yourself a life. I just made sure no one could take it away from you." They stood there in the doorway, the city alive around them, and Elena realized something she'd known for a while but hadn't put into words. She wasn't the same frightened girl Ryan had dragged into the street. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a woman who had fought for her place in the world, and won. And standing beside her was a man who had seen her at her lowest, and chosen to lift her up instead of using her weakness against her. "Come on," Adrian said, offering his arm. "Let's go celebrate. I hear the food here is incredible." Elena laughed and took his arm, and together they walked back into Cielo's. Not as boss and employee, not as savior and saved, but as partners, equals, two people who had found each other in the darkness and built something worth protecting in the light. And as they sat down at their usual table, Elena glanced out the window one last time, at the alley where it all began, where a dangerous man had said two simple words that changed everything. Let her go. He had, and in doing so, he'd set them both free. The months that followed the grand reopening of Cielo's brought changes neither Elena nor Adrian had anticipated. The restaurant became more than just a successful business. It became a gathering place, a community cornerstone, a symbol of what could happen when people refused to let their past define their future. Food critics from Manhattan made the trek to Brooklyn, writing glowing reviews about the authentic cuisine and warm atmosphere. Local families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries there. Young couples had first dates at the corner tables, and through it all, Elena and Adrian watched their creation thrive. But success brought its own challenges. With legitimacy came scrutiny. Tax auditors, health inspectors, liquor board officials, everyone wanted to make sure the former mob-owned establishment was playing by the rules. And it was. Every single rule. Adrian had made certain of that. He'd hired the best accountants, the most thorough lawyers, and had restructured every aspect of his business portfolio to withstand the harshest examination. It was exhausting, expensive, and completely necessary. Elena threw herself into the work with the same fierce determination she'd shown the night she'd swung that frying pan at a Volkov thug. She managed staff schedules, handled supplier negotiations, oversaw inventory, and somehow still found time to greet regular customers by name and remember their favorite dishes. The other employees, who had once whispered about her behind her back, now looked to her for guidance and support. She'd earned their respect the hard way, through competence, consistency, and by never asking them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. Adrian noticed. He always noticed. He'd catch himself watching her from across the dining room, marveling at how she'd transformed from a frightened waitress into a confident business owner. She moved through the restaurant with purpose and grace, solving problems before they escalated, making decisions with the kind of clarity that came from someone who'd fought for everything she had. She was remarkable. And somewhere along the way, admiration had turned into something deeper. One evening, after a particularly successful Saturday service, Adrian found Elena in the kitchen helping Sal and the line cooks with the final cleanup. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her white blouse had a small sauce stain on the sleeve, and she was laughing at something Sal had said, a genuine, unguarded laugh that lit up her entire face. "You don't have to do that, you know," Adrian said from the doorway. "You're the owner. You can go home." Elena looked up, still smiling. "So can you, but you're still here." Touché. Adrian leaned against the doorframe, his suit jacket long since discarded. His sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink that traced up his forearms. "Can we talk? Upstairs?" Something in his tone made Elena's pulse quicken. She nodded, dried her hands, and followed him up to the office they now shared, a larger space they'd created by knocking down a wall between two smaller rooms. It had 2 desks facing each other, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a small seating area where they often had their end-of-night debriefs. Adrian poured 2 glasses of wine, a Barolo they'd recently added to the menu, and handed one to Elena. They sat in the comfortable leather chairs by the window, the city lights twinkling below them. "I've been thinking," Adrian began, swirling the wine in his glass, "about what comes next." "The second location?" Elena asked. They'd been discussing expansion for months. "That. But also..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "About us." Elena's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks, maybe months. The lingering touches. The late-night conversations that had nothing to do with business. The way his eyes followed her across a room. The way her heart raced when he smiled at her. "What about us?" she asked softly. Adrian set down his glass and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I built my life on control, on knowing exactly what every move would cost and what it would gain. But you..." He shook his head with a small, almost helpless laugh. "You make me want to throw all of that away. You make me want things I convinced myself I couldn't have. Shouldn't have." Elena's heart was pounding now. "Like what?" "Like a normal life, a real partnership. Something that isn't built on fear or obligation or strategic advantage. Something that's just genuine." Adrian couldn't. "Let me finish," he said gently. "You could have left 100 times. After Ryan. After the Volkovs. After you saw what my world really looks like. But you stayed. Not because you were afraid to leave, but because you chose to stay. And that choice, your choice, means everything to me." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You protected me. You believed in me. How could I leave?" "That's not why you stayed," Adrian said, his dark eyes locked on hers. "You stayed because you're brave, because you're stubborn, because you refuse to let anyone, including me, define who you are or what you're capable of. You stayed because this place, this life, it's yours. You built it just as much as I did." "We built it together," Elena corrected. "Yes, we did." Adrian reached across the space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm, solid, grounding. "And I want to keep building. Not just the business. Everything. With you. If you want that too." Elena looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. This man who'd been a stranger in an alley, then a mysterious benefactor, then a partner, and now, something more. Something that had been growing between them for months, quiet and steady and undeniable. "I want that," she whispered. "I've wanted that for a long time." Adrian's smile was slow and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way she rarely saw. He stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they just stood there, hands clasped, the city spread out below them, and the future stretching ahead. "Then let's make it official," Adrian said. "Partners in everything, equal footing, no secrets, no games, just us." "Just us," Elena agreed. Adrian cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, Elena Rivera, and I'm going to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing to stay." And then he kissed her, soft and careful, like she was something precious. Elena's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms, feeling the warmth of him, the reality of this moment she'd been too afraid to hope for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Elena smiled up at him. "For the record, I don't regret anything." "Good," Adrian murmured against her forehead. "Because I'm not letting you go. Ever." Outside, Brooklyn hummed with life. Cars passed on the street below. The restaurant sign glowed warm and welcoming. And in that small office above Cielo's, two people who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances stood together, building something beautiful out of the broken pieces of their pasts. The next morning, they told the staff together. There were tears from Maria, a gruff nod of approval from Sal, and genuine happiness from everyone who'd watched their partnership evolve over the past year. Cielo's wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was proof that people could change, that second chances were real, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships became the strongest foundations. And when Elena stood beside Adrian that afternoon, watching him sign the papers for their second location, she thought about that terrified girl in a waitress uniform, being dragged into the street by a man who thought he owned her. She thought about the stranger who'd stepped out of the shadows and said two simple words that changed everything. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, capable, unafraid. She'd stopped running. She'd stopped hiding. And in doing so, she'd found something she never expected. A home, a purpose, and a partner who saw her not as someone to be protected, but as someone worth standing beside. The alley where it all began was just a few feet away, visible through the restaurant's new windows. Sometimes Elena would glance at it and remember, but mostly, she looked forward, at the dining room full of life, at the staff who'd become family, at the man who'd given her a chance to prove who she really was. And every single day, she proved it.